Hello, in the following video, let's learn how to solve for the x-intercept for this equation. Y equals sine of pi of x plus cosine pi of x. The first thing we need to do is, of course, set y to 0. Okay, next thing whenever we try to solve for any x-intercept, especially for a non-linear equation, is what can we factor out? Can we factor anything out? Well, we see what we have in common. We have pi of x and pi of x, but that's about it. But since this is sine and this is cosine, we can't factor it out, right? We can also try to factor out normally change sine to cosine, but unfortunately, we can't use this equation because we have a pi here, and this equation only is valid if it's this. Plus sign like this, right? Unfortunately, we have a pi of x here, so we can't use that. So that's the thing. Whenever we have something to do with trig, is we always refer back to the unit circle. So let me draw a circle right here. Let's draw a unit circle. There you go. I'm just gonna draw a line. I'm just gonna draw the first quadrant because it's a lot of work to draw the unit circle. Okay. I know it's not perfect, but it's good enough. And say this is pi over 3. This is pi over 4. This is pi over 6. So once we have these, we can try to see which of these have the requirements for this. So let's copy these requirements. Let's copy this equation here. Run selection tool. Copy this. Paste it here. Alright. What we see here from this equation is that it has to be something plus something equal to 0, right? Well, remember from algebra that if x plus its negative reciprocal, they cancel out. It equals 0. So now all we have to do is see what is going to cancel sine of pi of x out. Luckily for us, cosine is already the kind of inversely proportional to sine, because we see that 1 squared minus sine of pi of x squared, sine of x squared will equal cosine squared. So that means if sine is a very big number, cosine will decrease, right? Great, so all we have to do now is to set cosine to negative, because they both equal 1. So we just have to plus negative cosine pi of x. But these two must equal this directly, they must add up to 1. Without the negative, of course, they must add up to 1. Alright, so let's go back to our unit circle here to see which values will make sine positive and cosine negative, or cosine positive and sine negative. So let's draw a coordinate plane here. Alright, the coordinate plane. And if you guys remember from A2, remember this? In which in the first quadrant everything is positive, in the second quadrant only sine is positive, in the third quadrant only tangent is positive, and in the fourth quadrant only cosine is positive. So we can already rule out the first quadrant because it says everything is positive, right? Well, we can also rule out the third quadrant because of the fact that tangent is equal to sine over cosine. So if both things are negative, then it'll become a positive. A negative divided by a negative is a positive. So we can say that this cannot be it as well. So we have two left. We have the second quadrant right here and the fourth quadrant right here. So these two we need to use. So let's set the domain restriction now. That x. So we must find the values of sine and cosine between pi over 2 and pi, and 3 pi over 2 and 2 pi. Alright, now let's see which of these make sine and cosine cancel each other out and make them equal to 1. Well, I know for a fact that has to be one of these. here has to be pi over 4. Why? Because in pi over 4, it's an isosceles triangle. Let's draw the triangle right here. Okay, the triangle, right? And we know the side has to be 1. So what is a? So we can say a plus a, or 2a squared equals 1. Right? Because in the Pythagorean theorem, a squared plus b squared equals 1. But we know a squared plus a squared equals 1. So we're going to say 2a squared. Let's solve for a. By 2, and root both sides, root 1/2. Let's root 1/2 and see what we have. Square root of 1 over 2 is radical 2 over 2. So we know a equals radical 2 over 2, right? But you should already know this. I'm just proving it right now in your unit circle right here. That you should already know this. But just in case you don't, I'll rewrite it for you. Alright, so we got a equals radical 2 over 2. So now we can set each one to sine and cosine. Right? Alright, so let's say sine pi of x equals negative radical 2 over 2, or radical 2 over 2, and we can say the same thing for cosine. Right? Awesome! So let's find all the values between the restrictions we gave right here. Right? We have to follow these restrictions right here. Sorry, I was glitching. So, let's set the values. So I'm gonna say, so let's first find out all the values when sine equals negative radical 2 over 2. So I know sine equals negative radical 2 over 2 when it's either 5 pi over 4 or 7 pi over 4. But we already said that we cannot use the third quadrant, so the only option that's valid here is 7 pi over 4. Well, let's think about when the sine's positive. Well, sine's positive in pi over 4 and 3 pi over 4 when it equals negative radical 2 over 2. But since we said we can't use the first quadrant, we can only use 3 pi over 4. Alright, so the same thing for cosine. Well, I know cosine is negative between 3 pi, between negative, I know that cosine is negative when it's between pi over 2 and 3 pi over 2, but we can't not use the third quadrant, so we can say that has to be 3 pi over 4. We can also say that cosine is positive between pi over 2 and 3 pi over 2 in the right-hand quadrant, right? But we can only use the fourth quadrant, so we can only say that it's positive in 7 pi over 4. Let's find the angles when it goes in the negative direction. Well, 7 pi over 4 is just negative pi over 4, and 3 pi over 4 is just negative 5 pi over 4. And we can see how these two are the same, so we can already just rewrite them on the bottom as well. Negative pi over 4 and negative 5 pi over 4. Awesome! So we have narrowed down to these 4 things. So let's take away the sine and cosine now that we solved for each one. And bring all these answers to the next page. Let's take these answers. Let's take. Okay. Let's take the answers over here. And let's divide each one by pi, because remember it's pi over x equals these answers now. So divide each one by pi. And you can see all the pi cancel out. So our final 4 answers are x equals negative 1/4, 5 pi, 5 over 4. Oh, this is 1/4, my bad. This is negative 5/4, this is 3 over 4, and this is 7 over 4. Now let's test each one in the calculator to make sure we're correct. First thing you need to do is make sure your calculator is set in radian mode. So let's set the calculator in radian mode. Alright. And then what we can do is just say sine of pi times 1/4. Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. Negative 1/4 plus cosine of pi times negative 1/4. And you can see it equals 0. Let's try for all the other answers to make sure we're correct. Alright. Awesome. And voila. And that's how we concluded that the answers for 0 equals sine pi of x plus cosine pi of x is equal to these answers. Let me rewrite that just a little more clear. 1/4, negative 5/4, 3/4, and 7/4. Hope you found this educational, and don't forget to subscribe. Thanks.